With Russell Wilson gone, do the Seattle Seahawks stand any chance of making it back to the playoffs without him? Tune in to find out. What is going on, everyone? It is Connor, the co-host with the most, back with another 2022 Clutch Crew Sports NFL preview, this time looking at the Seattle Seahawks. We're getting down towards the end of our NFL previews. We're down to the final 10 teams. I think we have about 6 left after the Seahawks video comes out. And so if you missed any of the ones that we've had already, make sure you go back and check those out, and make sure you stay tuned for all of our future ones. But let's get right in here talking about the Seattle Seahawks. So the big story, of course, with the Seattle Seahawks is Russell Wilson is now a Denver Bronco. He was traded during the offseason, and now comes the big question of the quarterback situation. And unfortunately for the Seattle Seahawks, their situation is not very good. They have Geno Smith and Drew Lock as the two guys that are going to be battling it out for the quarterback job. There are some rumors circling around that once the new league year, once the new season gets underway, if the 49ers decide to release Jimmy Garoppolo, there is a chance that the Seahawks could bring him in. The Seahawks have already said they're not going to try and trade for him, but the Seahawks, basically them and Cleveland, are the two places that potentially Jimmy Garoppolo could end up if the 49ers decide to release him. But as for right now, it's between Geno Smith and Drew Lock, and apparently Geno Smith is leading the way right now. I'm not sure I'd want either of these guys to be my quarterback. Geno has been a proven, backup, a proven bench warmer in the NFL. He did play okay in some of the games that he came in for them last year. Drew Lock never made it in Denver. He could never hold down the starting job. So definitely an interesting situation here. I guess their hope is that, they're going to start with Geno, and then maybe Drew Lock can develop some more and get into the role, or maybe they're just hoping to get a quarterback next year in the draft. Who knows? But definitely not a good situation for Pete Carroll and the Seahawks. It's not like neither of these guys are starting caliber. You at least hope that in some of these scenarios that you'll have a starting caliber guy, even though he may not be particularly good. At least you have a starting caliber quarterback, and I don't see either of these guys as being starting caliber. So definitely going to be interesting to see how it resolves. But in my opinion, I think Geno Smith will probably win the job, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if over the course of the season they moved around and swapped QBs a couple times, just because neither of these guys are good. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. So that being said, the Seahawks, of course, are in a rebuild. Like I said, they let go of Russell Wilson. They had to choose between Pete Carroll or Russell Wilson. I'll get into Pete Carroll a little bit later. But they had to choose between them two and who they thought they wanted to stick with, and they ended up sticking with Pete Carroll. Wouldn't have been my choice, if I was being honest. I would have stuck with Russell Wilson. I probably would have fired Pete Carroll, and, they're never going to really fire Pete Carroll, but, I would have chosen Russell Wilson over Pete Carroll had it been my choice. But, they've made their bed, and now they got to sleep in it, so they do have Pete Carroll still and no more Russell Wilson. So it is rebuild in Seattle. It's going to be interesting to see how Pete Carroll does with this rebuild, just because, he never really has been in a situation so far with this team where he's been in a real rebuild situation. There was actually a time a couple seasons ago when a lot of the Legion of Boom members were leaving, Cam Chancellor retired, and Earl Thomas went to Baltimore, and Richard Sherman went to San Francisco. They thought, the Seahawks, they're in a rebuild. And then they came back, and they actually still ended up, competing for the playoffs. I can't remember if they made it that year or not, but they still had a winning record. So who knows what's going to go on there. But so the main thing here is, of course, what are the most needed pieces on this team during a rebuild? And first and foremost, it's going to start with the offensive line, just because the rest of their offense outside of the quarterback is actually in pretty good hands. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are one of the best receiving duos in the league. Noah Fant is a really solid tight end. Rashad Penny and Kenneth Walker could make a really good running back duo. But the offensive line is still atrocious. They don't have any, other than, Gabe Jackson, they don't have any real established offensive linemen on that line. And Gabe Jackson's, of course, getting older, and he is coming off an injury. So, it's definitely going to be something that they're going to have to look for in the draft. You know, if they're not looking for quarterback, they should be looking for offensive line, because it's something that's really plagued this Seattle team over the last few seasons. It's one of the reasons why I think Russell Wilson really wanted to, was not having a good time, because he was always back there running for his life because the O-line was terrible. So definitely going to have to start there, looking at the O-line. And really after that, it's just on the defensive side of the ball. You know, it's really, when it comes to the linebacking position, you know, they do have Jordan Brooks at the linebacking position, who is looking like a good young star, but they did lose Bobby Wagner to the Los Angeles Rams. And after that, their linebacking core looks pretty weak. Uchenna Nwosu and Cody Barton are not going to strike fear into anyone. So definitely a big key for them to bring in some linebackers, maybe through free agency or through the draft. You know, it's looking like Roquan Smith could potentially be available once free agency comes around. You know, him and the Bears are kind of in a spitting match at the moment. So, you know, that would be a huge piece to bring onto this defense if they were to upgrade the linebacking core. And finally, the cornerback position. You know, the safety position, in my mind, there's still question marks there too. Like, I do like Quandre Diggs, but I'm really not a fan of Jamal Adams. I think he's really overrated. He's more of like a, you know, he's like if you took Troy Polamalu and took out his ability to cover, you'd have Jamal Adams. Like, he's a great blitzer. He's great against the run. You know, he is really good at that sort of the game. He just can't cover. Like I said, he's Troy Polamalu without the ability to cover. So I really am not a fan of Jamal Adams. I don't think he's really, you know, people like to classify him as a top 5 safety, and I honestly wouldn't classify him in the top 10. Like, he's a top 15 safety, but he's not a top 10 safety in my mind. He's more of like a hybrid linebacker sort of player. I think he'd be better in a linebacker role than a safety role. So there are question marks there, but like I said, I like Quandre Diggs, but it's really the cornerback position. You know, Sidney Jones and Artie Burns are set to be their starting cornerbacks, and you know, I have firsthand experience watching Artie Burns since he played in Pittsburgh, and he's not good at all. Sidney Jones is really not a CB1 level player. So there's definitely a lot of pieces that this team are going to need to rebuild here in the future, but O-line is definitely the biggest concern in my mind, and that's what they need to look for first. Assuming they don't, you know, try and pick up a quarterback somewhere, because quarterback's obviously very important too, but O-line especially, they need O-line pieces. So finally, moving on and looking at the future for Pete Carroll. And, you know, like I said, I mentioned this earlier in the video that there's never going to be a situation in my mind where they fire Pete Carroll, you know, quote-unquote fire. Just because I feel like, you know, he led this team to 2 Super Bowls. He's kind of a cornerstone of the franchise at this point. And it's going to be one of those situations in my mind that, you know, the day that he ends up leaving, basically they're just going to kind of force him to step down. Like, they'll force him to resign, they'll force him to retire. You know, they might offer him a position like a front office position or something like that. But in my mind, I do see Pete Carroll, I do see his tenure in Seattle coming to an end sometime in the near future, because, you know, he's part of this kind of dying breed of old school coaches. You know, there's been a youth I don't know what word I'm looking for here, like, there's been a lot of youth that's come when it comes to the new coaches in the NFL, and Pete Carroll's obviously on the opposite end of that spectrum. And, you know, he's not really the best coach to be working with a team that needs a quarterback too. You know, he's more of a defensive-minded head coach, and, you know, this is the team that's going to be looking to bring in a young quarterback and develop a young quarterback. And in my mind, he's not the head coach for that. You know, he's just past his prime at this point, so I definitely see him probably sticking around for a couple more seasons, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming years, you know, maybe 2 to 3 years from now, if Pete Carroll is no longer the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. I think it would be in their best interests. I mean, you know, I already said at the beginning of the video that, you know, when it came down to picking between Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson, I would have picked Russell Wilson in a heartbeat, but the Seahawks decided to pick Pete Carroll instead, so we'll see how this rebuild goes with him, but, you know, his time may get cut more quickly if the rebuild doesn't go the way they think it's going to go. You know, I'm sure they're hoping that, you know, once they bring in some more pieces in this upcoming offseason, they're probably hoping in 1 to 2 years' time that they can get back to competing for a playoff spot. But if that doesn't happen and they're still out here with losing records, then, you know, I could definitely see him going out the door quicker than expected. So looking at the schedule here for the Seattle Seahawks, obviously they play in the NFC West, the toughest division in the NFC. So they have a lot of divisional games that, unfortunately for them, I could see them possibly maybe stealing one of them at some point. That's kind of how the NFC West goes. Like the Rams used to do that to the Seahawks all the time. Back in like the mid 2010s when the Seahawks were the powerhouse and the Rams were struggling, the Rams would always somehow find a way to beat the Seahawks. So, I could definitely see them stealing a game or two there. They do also play against the AFC South, so they have winnable games at home against Atlanta and against Carolina. They have to go on the road to play New Orleans and Tampa, though, so those are probably going to be losses. They have a couple games against both of the New York teams, the Giants and the Jets at home, so those could be winnable games, too. This is a team that definitely, they're a really tough team at home, and, even if they're not as good on paper, that home field advantage that the Seahawks have is really monumental, and they could win some games that they possibly wouldn't win otherwise. Especially given that, they do have a lot of winnable games at home this year. So looking at the over-under, their over-under is set at 5.5 wins. Vegas clearly sees this as a rebuilding team. Last year, their over-under was set at 9.5, and they finished 7-10. I am actually going to say that I think they go over the 5.5, but I think it's going to be like 6 wins, like 6-11, because like I said, they have these games against the Giants and the Jets and the Falcons and the Panthers. They have a road game against Detroit, which I know Detroit's going to be improved this year, but I could definitely see them still winning that one potentially, and I do see them stealing a divisional game or two. Against some of these teams, possibly against like Arizona or against San Francisco early in the year when San Francisco is still trying to figure stuff out, or they have their home game against Arizona while DeAndre Hopkins is still going to be suspended, so they could win that game as well. So I definitely see them going over the 5.5, but I would basically call it like 6 wins is the reason why they're going over. I'd say they finish 6-11. They of course missed the playoffs, and we'll see where they go from here, but this upcoming offseason is really what I'm sure a lot of Seahawks fans are going to be looking forward to, because in my mind, they don't have any real chance at all to make the playoffs, especially playing in the NFC West. Like, if they played in the NFC East, they might have a better chance, but playing in the NFC West, I see absolutely no chance for them to make the playoffs this year. So, unfortunately, a bit of a dim outlook for the Seattle Seahawks in my mind. But make sure you guys comment down below whether you agree with my take on the Seahawks or not. Make sure you like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that bell so you can get notified for all of our future videos. Like I said, we're coming down to the end of these NFL previews. We're getting closer to the NFL season, so I know Zach and Eric and I are all excited for that. And we'll be releasing, of course, a lot more content once the season starts up and gets going. But until then, guys, I will see you guys next time.